A lot of talk still about the Indigenous voice to Parliament. The member for Curtin, Kate Chaney, the independent member, is a strong supporter of it. I spoke to her earlier about the yes side and how it's tracking, including the extent to which Labor is performing well.
There definitely have been some challenges, but I think as we get closer to the date, a lot of people will turn their minds to it who haven't really thought about it much yet. And in my electorate, I'm having lots of conversations with people who are hearing the division and the noise, but really just want to understand what the voice is and isn't. And I think when it comes down to it, it's quite simple. We're really bad at developing policy on Indigenous affairs. When you're bad at something, you get advice, and this is about advice. And when people realise that it's that simple, I think that they are coming round.
Labor's handling of it is obviously important. The past week's been pretty messy. They almost seem to not want to mention a treaty. Do you think overall Labor, the PM and Minister and so on, are handling this campaign and everything around it very well?
Well, it's tricky because although it does involve politicians, a referendum is about the people deciding. And what I'm really enjoying seeing is community groups playing a more active role, volunteers on the ground, rather than it just being about the noise in politics. On the issue of treaty, it's a longer term question. It's not what we're deciding this year. And I think it is proving to be a distraction from the very simple proposition that's going to a referendum in a few months' time.
Part of it might be the No campaign wanting to mention it as a distraction, but it's still part of the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Did you think the way Labor sort of managed that, because initially you sort of don't mention it, then saying, yes, that's the next logical step, you know, is it not very unified or cohesive the way the PM's handling this at the moment, do you think?
Well, I think it's very difficult because as soon as the conversation starts to be about the treaty, it gets confusing. And we've seen in other contexts, you know, there's been the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act in Western Australia, and that's caused some confusion as well with people thinking that that's somehow got something to do with the voice. So I think that it's the right approach to just focus on what the referendum actually is about, which is that simple change to guarantee that we will keep listening on policy that affects Aboriginal people. Treaty, you know, will follow. That's a longer term issue. Most countries around the world that are in a similar situation have some version of a treaty, but it could be decades away.
There's a big backtrack, you mentioned there, the Cultural Heritage Act from the WA Premier. What did you make of it, and will it still be damaging to the voice that it was out there and seemingly with this sort of overreach and too much impost on landholders?
I think it's good that the government in WA has realised that this is not ready to be rolled out and needs more consultation.
Took a little while though.
Well, it did, that's right, and I think that's definitely a problem. After Juukan Gorge, we don't want to see more of that happening. I think everyone wants to ensure that we are actually protecting significant sites.
Which it still wants to do, but it seemed to be a pretty big, blunt instrument.
Yeah, well, I think there's more work to be done in making sure that people know what their obligations are and that those are reasonable. And I'm glad that it will, you know, be removed from the conversation about a much bigger, longer-term issue of the voice in Australia.
When, after the referendum, the last one failed on a republic in Australia, a lot of people who were proponents said, we got too involved with celebrities. We made it too much about celebrities. Peter Dutton is criticising the Yes campaign, saying there's too many companies that are sort of telling people how to vote or ramming it down people's throat. He's had some pretty strong language. Does he have a point? Are people sort of a bit put off by companies running strong lines on it?
I think it's not just companies. There are more than 500 organisations, and they are not just companies but community groups, sporting groups, churches that have come out and said, we've had a good look at this and we've decided to support the Yes campaign. No organisations have come out and said that they're going to support the No campaign. And every committee member on every one of those organisations who's been part of that decision to support the Yes has looked at the information and made a decision that they think is in the best interest of their community and their country.
So you see it as a positive, that contribution? I mentioned companies, community groups as well. The more support, the better?
Well, absolutely. I think that our society is made up of communities and groups of different sorts, whether that's your employer or your footy club or your church. And they are the organisations that we are part of and that we listen to that make up the fabric of what holds us together.
Just finally, you had a bit to say about the protesters at the Woodside CEO Meg O'Neill's house. Their response as to, you know, why they've done this for, you know, people say going beyond the sort of scope of normal protests is if you do a normal protest, nobody listens. Is that a fair argument?
I think there's a lot of frustration out there. Now, I think going to someone's house crosses the line and it doesn't help the cause because then we end up talking about that instead of the big issue that we should be talking about, which is that we're looking at a processing facility in Burrup that is about to be approved potentially through to 2070. Now, that's 50 years away. It's 20 years after we're meant to hit net zero. And the emissions from the gas, from extracting and using the gas in that facility, that's as much as Australia's entire emissions budget from 2030 onwards all the way to net zero at 2050. So it's a huge project. It has a huge impact on Australia and the world.
It has other energy uses, doesn't it? That's the argument from Labor. It's not just about gas.
At the Burrup hub, that's most of it. I mean, that's really what it's about.
Could be hydrogen down the track, they're saying.
Well, potentially, but at the moment it's based on gas and the emissions from that are absolutely massive.
So you have some sympathy for protesters that a normal protest doesn't work, but the House is going too far. What's the middle ground?
Well, I don't know. And I think that there are a lot of people who are very frustrated about that, but people have a right to their privacy in their own house. And I think that was the wrong side of the line.
If they're outside where she works, going in and out, fair enough?
I think protesting, people have a right to protest. It's part of free speech in Australia, and outside a workplace seems a reasonable thing to me.